What if the girl you just met suddenly told you that you were her mortal enemy in a past life? That's exactly what happens to this boy, a normal 14-year-old who discovers that his strange dreams are actually memories from lives he has already lived. Now this girl wants to end their cycle of reincarnation for good, while mysterious spirits and another girl begin appearing around him. And with 7 more deaths waiting to be remembered, our boy is about to uncover a past far more terrifying than he ever imagined. 3 months earlier, in September, 14-year-old Fuuta Okaya was on his way to school when someone called his name. It was Daiki, with Tetsu right beside him. Fuuta greeted them back, as he remembered his father's belief that kids were at the top of the world. On the way to school, Daiki mentioned a new transfer student. He had heard about it from Mr. Azuma. Daiki wondered if the new student was smart, while Tetsu hoped they were tough. Fuuta had only one wish, that the newcomer would be shorter than him. Their new classmate soon introduced herself as Kouko Ishigami, and politely said she looked forward to getting along with everyone. The teacher welcomed her, and pointed her toward the empty seat at the back. Kouko bowed to the class before taking her seat. Umi, Nono, Tetsu, and Daiki exchanged surprised looks as they watched the unexpected transfer student. Most of the class was staring at the scar across Kouko's forehead, but Fuuta had noticed something else entirely. To him, she was simply beautiful, and the sight of her left our boy blushing. Once she sat down, Fuuta nervously introduced himself, but the real surprise was just about to begin, and trust me, you're going to want to see how this goes. Kouko immediately scoffed and bluntly called his name dumb. Fuuta froze, completely confused by the insult. Before Fuuta can process the insult, a ghost named East suddenly appears beside them in strange robes and casually introduces himself. East chuckles, smiles, and then fades away. Fuuta breaks into a nervous sweat, already sensing that this is going to be a strange day. Later, several classmates gather around Kouko outside the school, curious about where she came from and what she likes to do. Nono introduces herself as Miyabe Nonomura and tells Kouko to just call her Nono. Umi introduces herself next and says Kouko can call her Umi. Kouko explains that she recently moved from Tokyo and spends most of her free time playing games on her phone. Nearby, Tetsu grumbles that having a girl as the transfer student takes all the fun out of things. Daiki disagrees, pointing out that Kouko is pretty cute. Meanwhile, Fuuta quietly studies the ghost beside her, surprised by just how tall East is. Tetsu looks confused by his comment. Fuuta quickly laughs it off and claims he was just talking to himself. Daiki wonders if Fuuta is getting into that hocus-pocus stuff again. Tetsu dismisses it as nonsense and asks if Fuuta is messing with them. Fuuta breaks into a nervous sweat as East casually waves from behind them. He wishes the ghost were just in his head, but his eyes tell him otherwise. When Fuuta first told his father about his ability, his dad simply called it a special power and another privilege of being young. After realizing how obsessed his father is with youth, Fuuta decides to stop talking about it. He never asked for this ability, and seeing ghosts is anything but fun. His father then shamelessly holds out both hands and tells him to trade eyes if he hates the ability, basically asking for his own son's eyeballs. Fuuta slumps beside East, wondering what is so great about being young when he already has enough problems, like being too short. Suddenly, East softly says the names Fortuna and Rune, making Fuuta look up in surprise. A memory takes shape as East walks through a grassy field, holding hands with a young girl. He urges Fortuna and Rune to hurry before they miss the festival. Phone waves back and assures him that they are coming. Ray smiles and reaches out her hand, asking Phone if they should get going. Phone agrees, and Ray gives East and the young girl one last wave. As the memory fades, she reflects on how much time has passed since then. Kouko tightly holds East's hand, quietly realizing how long it has been since those days. The four continue walking across the field, their peaceful moment carrying a strange sense of sadness. Fuuta suddenly snorts awake at his desk while the rest of the class listens to the lesson. He rubs his sleepy eyes, wondering what kind of strange dream he just had. The dream stays on his mind. They had simply kept walking together, but he cannot stop wondering who they were and why they called him Fortuna. Strangely, the dream had left him feeling warm and comforted. That feeling suddenly disappears when tears fill his eyes. He sniffles, confused about why he feels so sad. No matter how hard he tries to hold them back, the tears keep falling. Embarrassed, Fuuta hides his face in his arms and hopes nobody notices him crying. Kouko turns around and asks if he is okay. Fuuta quickly wipes his eyes and claims some dirt got into them. But when he looks at her, Fuuta suddenly realizes something shocking. Kouko was in his dream too. Fuuta remembers that Kouko was much younger in the dream, but he is certain it was still her. He also remembers how much he cared about her back then. Believing the dream must mean something, Fuuta decides to become friends with her. Meanwhile, Kouko quietly reads her book. He keeps his face buried in his arms and hums to himself, his cowlick sticking straight up. A moment later, Fuuta sits up, wipes his face, and convinces himself that he is fine now. Kouko watches as he rubs his eyes and hypes himself up, reminding himself that he is young, unstoppable, and definitely not scared of that giant ghost. Fuuta gives a confident snicker, only for snot to drip from his nose. Kouko glances over with clear disgust. The final bell rings, and the students head into the hallway. Fuuta sees his chance to make a better first impression. He approaches Kouko with a smile, but the others get there first. Tetsu suggests track and field, Umi mentions judo, Nono recommends the art club, and Daiki invites her to the historical society. Kouko asks what the historical society does, so Daiki happily explains that they study history and share what they learn. Kouko agrees to check it out and leaves with Daiki. Tetsu groans, saying he expected her to be more athletic, while Umi agrees. Nono, meanwhile, worries about how they will recruit new members. Art class begins, but Fuuta cannot concentrate. His thoughts keep drifting back to Kouko. After Nono waves goodbye, Fuuta heads home. Before long, his imagination starts running wild with thoughts of Kouko in a swimsuit. He quietly wonders if this is what falling in love feels like. The realization hits him hard. Fuuta covers his burning face, relieved that those embarrassing thoughts stayed in his head. He admits he cannot stop thinking about Kouko. Then he looks ahead and spots East walking along the path below. East smiles and waves at him. Remembering the dream where he held Koko's hand, Fuuta decides to ignore the ghost and keep moving. A moment later, he spots Kouko coming toward him and eagerly waves. He wonders if she can see East too, or if they simply happen to meet by chance. Fuuta greets her and asks if she lives nearby. Kouko explains that the historical society finished early, so she decided to explore the neighborhood. She admits she is still unfamiliar with the area since she only recently moved there. Fuuta cannot hide his excitement and eagerly offers to show Kouko around the neighborhood. She politely turns him down, saying she has already seen enough for today. Still refusing to give up, our boy asks if they can explore together tomorrow instead. Kouko calmly says she prefers exploring on her own. Fuuta desperately searches for something else to talk about. He considers asking if she can see East, but either answer would make things awkward. Instead, he asks if she plans to join the historical society or try art. Kouko says she has not decided yet and is not interested in art. Sweat forms on Fuuta's face as he struggles to keep the conversation going. Kouko adds that she is not interested in track or judo either, despite all the invitations. Fuuta falls silent and gives a quiet nod, clearly disappointed. Then he suddenly throws his arms out and tells her she does not need to join any club. But he insists she should make some friends because everyone in their class is genuinely nice. His sudden outburst catches her completely off guard. Fuuta nervously waves his hands around, desperately searching for an example. He points out Tetsuma Mashiro from the track team. Despite his intimidating appearance, Fuuta explains that he practices kenpo every weekend and would never hurt anyone. Next, he mentions Umi, pointing out that she may be short and wear glasses, but she is incredibly strong and even captains the judo team. Fuuta gestures above his head to show how tall Nono is. She is Umi's best friend, an amazing artist, and absolutely terrible at sports. Then he brings up Daiki Takayama from the Historical Society, praising him for always ranking near the top of the class and getting along with every teacher. Fuuta explains that they have all been friends since grade school, and insists that Kouko should get to know them because they are genuinely good people. Kouko covers her mouth and quietly laughs, leaving Fuuta stunned that he actually managed to make her smile. Still giggling, she asks if he always puts this much effort into promoting his friends. She admits he has convinced her and says he must be a kind person himself. Kouko adds that the way he talks makes it obvious how much he cares about his friends. Fuuta turns bright red and stammers in embarrassment. As he looks at her beautiful smile, he becomes even more convinced that she is the girl from his dreams. Kouko closes her eyes for a moment and apologizes. She admits Fuuta reminded her of someone she hated, but now realizes she was mistaken. She decides to head home and tells Fuuta she will see him tomorrow. He happily agrees while East watches from nearby. East cheerfully waves goodbye. Without thinking, Fuuta answers him out loud. Kouko suddenly stops and looks back, asking what he just said. Caught off guard, Fuuta scratches his head and awkwardly claims he said nothing. Kouko stares at him and quietly asks if he was talking to East. She steps closer and asks if he can actually see him, leaving Fuuta completely stunned. Fuuta nervously admits that he can, at least a little. Instead of reacting, Kouko steps closer and asks about the patch on his cheek. She reaches toward his face and firmly tells him to take it off. Fuuta immediately starts panicking. After a tense silence, he slowly peels off the patch, revealing a strange birthmark on his cheek. Kouko stares at the birthmark in tense silence. After a nervous swallow, she asks Fuuta how long he has had it. He awkwardly touches his cheek and explains that it is just a birthmark he usually keeps covered because it looks strange. He then admits he admires how confidently Kouko shows her own scar. Without warning, Kouko grabs him by the collar with a dark expression, completely catching Fuuta off guard. Fuuta gasps as she declares with absolute certainty that she was right all along. He is her enemy. Futa's eyes widen in panic as he begs her to wait and explain what she means. Kouko keeps hold of his collar as a mysterious ring covered in strange symbols suddenly appears in her hand. Fuuta stares at it, wondering where it came from. She glares at him and declares that the scar on her forehead proves who she truly is, and she wears it with pride. She then points to the cursed mark on Futa's face, saying it is the kind of mark that deserves to stay hidden. Fuuta struggles against her grip, reminding her that they only met today. How could they possibly be enemies? Kouko firmly tells him that their history goes back much further. He desperately tries to pull free, insisting that he is telling the truth and has never met her before. Kouko asks Fuuta if he has ever heard of reincarnation. The word leaves our boy staring at her in disbelief. Still held by the collar, Fuuta blurts out that she must be crazy to believe in something like that. Kouko fires back that he should look in a mirror before swinging her massive ring into his face. The blow sends Fuuta flying. He cries out in pain, demanding to know why she hit him. As he flies through the air, Fuuta realizes with horror that he is about to tumble down a massive staircase. He crashes down the steep steps, rolling end over end as his screams echo through the air. Mid-fall, Futa's appearance suddenly transforms into Phone's before he slams into the ground. Phone groans and rubs the back of his head after the painful landing. Ancient ruins tower over the jungle cliffs behind him. Ray smiles warmly and asks if Phone fell asleep in a tree again. Still on the ground, he rubs his aching head and winces. Phone looks up and greets Ray. She reminds him to be more careful before asking if he had another dream. As they walk hand in hand through the forest, Phone tells her about a strange place and an angry girl from his dream. Ray curiously asks if the girl was really that angry. Ray gently squeezes his hand and says that if he is going to dream, he should dream about her instead. Suddenly, tiny spirits pop out of the ground and happily call Phone's name. The little spirits gather around them, asking if Phone is hurt and whether he is heading home. He reassures them that he is fine and promises to visit again. Ray says it is a shame Phone was not born into the oracles. He agrees and turns toward her. Phone admits he is actually glad things turned out this way. If Ray could hear the spirits too, she would realize that the ceremony is nothing but a sham. Ray shakes her head, insisting that the ceremony could not possibly be fake. Phone explains that the spirits only know the beauty and joy of life. They know nothing about magic or divine mysteries. To them, death is simply the end, which is why every moment of life should be treasured. A voice calls from farther down the forest path. Ray happily waves to her father, still holding Phone's hand. Her father arrives with wonderful news. This year's chosen sacrifice is Ray. She excitedly claps her hands while Phone stands completely frozen. 3 small white spirits emerge from the ground with cheerful smiles. Phone remembers seeing them ever since he was a child. His father warns young Phone to keep his ability secret, especially from the priesthood. The boy sits beside the 3 spirits, knowing he must hide his power. Phone knows the priests use magic to protect the people, and only their bloodline is said to possess such power. He imagines the priests discovering his secret and restraining him. If they learned about his ability, Phone fears his life would be ruined. Yet Phone knows the truth. He can use magic too, despite everyone believing only priests possess it. Ray asks who Phone was talking to. He looks back at the 3 spirits, unsure how to explain what she cannot see. Without warning, Ray turns and runs away. Phone calls after her, wondering what just happened. Ray grabs a wooden stick and charges straight back at him. Phone realizes she is coming for him and raises his hand in shock. Ray swings the stick at Phone and screams for the demon to die. Our boy barely ducks in time, narrowly avoiding the attack. Phone reaches out and tells Ray to stop and look at him, but she loses her balance and tumbles to the ground. He points at himself and insists that he is human, then introduces himself as Phone, the shoemaker Frio's son. Ray recognizes Frio as her father's friend and realizes Phone is human. Relieved, he asks why she is in the woods. Ray explains that she is gathering medicine for her feverish mother. Phone wonders why she was more afraid of him than a demon. Phone tells Ray to wait and quickly runs off, leaving her puzzled. He returns with 3 small berries and tells Ray to give them to her mother along with the medicine. Ray stares at the berries and asks what they are. Phone admits he has no idea himself. The local spirits told Phone the berries would help her mother recover, so he trusts their advice. He assures Ray that spirits know these things. Ray's eyes widen as she realizes Phone can talk to spirits and asks if he can see them too. Phone nervously rubs the back of his head and admits that he can see them, but he is not a priest. Phone asks Ray to keep his ability a secret. She happily agrees, but wants a favor in return, making Phone wonder what she has in mind. Ray introduces herself with a warm smile and asks Phone if they can meet again. Phone blushes and nervously scratches his head before agreeing. In that moment, he realizes he has fallen in love with her. The next morning, Ray excitedly jumps into Phone's arms and tells him that her mother's fever has broken. Phone tries to explain that he was not responsible. From then on, Phone and Ray grow closer, spending their days together and slowly falling in love. They share countless peaceful moments, from trying on sandals to simply enjoying each other's company. For 2 years, the pair spends peaceful days together among the forest spirits, growing closer with every passing day. One day, Ray and Phone walk hand in hand through the woods when her father appears and waves to them. Ray smiles happily, while Phone is caught off guard. But their peaceful days come to an end when Ray is carried before a gathered crowd. A hooded priest stands nearby as the time comes for the ritual held once every 8 years. The priest declares that divine visions have chosen Ray as the sacrifice. Her blood, he claims, will satisfy the earth and bring blessings to their land, as the crowd praises the gods and the priesthood. Near a stone wall, Phone and his father listen as the speaker calls on everyone to honor the families of the sacrifice and her lover. Phone's father congratulates him on their good fortune, but Phone looks down, knowing this is anything but luck. The hooded priest announces that the ceremony will take place in 3 days. The crowd erupts in cheers as he calls for praise. Amid the celebration, Ray raises her hand with a bittersweet smile and looks toward Phone. Later, Ray apologizes for having to leave so soon. She asks Phone to stay alive for the village and become a master cobbler like his father. Phone refuses to accept that future. He wants to become a warrior, believing warriors are the ones who truly protect people, not priests or sacrifices. Ray playfully reminds him that a craftsman's son cannot simply become a warrior. Craftsmen are too valuable to be sent to war. The spirits tell Phone the truth about the ritual. Ray's blood will accomplish nothing, no miracle will come from it, and everyone has a greater fate waiting for them. Ray understands why the villagers cling to the ritual. They fear sickness and failed crops, so they believe they need something to give them hope. Still, Ray accepts her fate. If sacrificing herself can bring peace to her people, she believes it is the least she can do. Phone questions why Ray calls it giving up. She looks away in silence, unable to answer him. He grabs her shoulder and desperately begs her to admit that she does not want to die. Phone asks her to run away with him so they can live together. Tears fill Ray's eyes as she looks at Phone and quietly confesses her feelings. Despite her sadness, Ray smiles and tells Phone not to stay depressed. He has already made her the happiest girl in the world. From the cliff above, Ray tells Phone to cheer up, find someone else, and send her off with a smile. Phone remains bowed in grief as the spirits gather around him, calling his name and urging him to cheer up. Then Phone places his hands against the ground and makes a decision. If warriors truly exist to protect others, he has to act. The hooded priest Stona, child of Selv, raises his weapon and announces the beginning of the ceremony, calling it an honor. A massive stone pyramid towers over the gathered crowd. The priest orders everyone to kneel and pray as they bid farewell to the chosen sacrifice. Ray lies motionless on the ceremonial platform in her ritual attire as the villagers watch from below. Phone suddenly rises from the kneeling crowd with a weapon in hand. The villagers stare in shock, wondering why Frio's son has interrupted the ritual. He breaks through the crowd and sprints toward the massive stone steps as people shout for him to stop. 2 armed guards block the stairs and order Phone to turn back. He refuses and demands that they get out of his way. Phone swings his rope weapon in a wide arc, forcing the guards back before charging up the platform. He leaves the guards sprawled behind and races up the steep pyramid steps, determined to save Ray. Phone grits his teeth and pushes forward, repeating one thought in his mind. He has to fight, save Ray, and escape with her. Phone reaches the top and screams Ray's name. The hooded priest stands over her lifeless body, holding a bleeding heart above a chalice. The priest drops the heart into the chalice beside Ray's body. Phone stares at the altar in horror, finally realizing what has happened. The priest raises his dagger and declares that anyone who interferes with the ritual will be executed. Enraged, Phone screams and charges at him. Phone swings his weapon at the priest, knocking off her hood. Her face is revealed, and Phone realizes in shock that she is the one who killed Ray. The girl glares at him as her hair blows in the wind. Phone stares at her face, trying to remember where he has seen her before. Then recognition hits him. Phone realizes he has seen that face before. Before he can react, the priest strikes him down, sending blood across the stone platform. Phone collapses in disbelief, wondering how he lost and whether he is about to die. The spirits gather around Phone and sadly bid him farewell. They warn that his hatred and anger will follow him into his next life as he screams in agony over losing Rei. Fuuta suddenly snaps back to the present with a terrified gasp. He clutches his chest and screams as the memory finally ends. Fuuta struggles to breathe, gasping heavily while clutching his aching neck. Covered in sweat, he opens his eyes and tries to convince himself that he is all right. Kouko stands beside the hospital bed and says she is relieved that Fuuta Okeya is all right. Fuuta sits up, still sweating and holding his neck in confusion. Kouko explains that Fuuta slipped and fell down the stairs in the park. She called an ambulance and brought him to the hospital, then asks if he slept well and had any dreams. Fuuta touches his cheek and repeats his own name, slowly realizing he is in a hospital. He wonders if everything he saw was just a dream. Still clutching his neck, Fuuta sits up and stares across the room at Kouko. He calls her name, but after studying her face, another name comes to mind, Stona. Kouko coldly confirms that he is right. Kouko reveals that this was the first memory he has recovered. She tells Fuuta not to play the victim and calls him a coward, leaving him stunned. Kouko gives Fuuta a cold stare and delivers the horrifying truth. He still has 7 more deaths to relive. Nono suddenly rushes into the room, crying out Futa's name with her arms wide open. Fuuta jumps in surprise as Kouko turns toward her. Tears stream down Nono's face as she explains that she heard Fuuta fall down the stairs and anxiously asks if he is all right. Fuuta calmly raises a hand and tells Nono to take a deep breath. Kouko places a hand on her chest and hesitantly confirms that her classmate is Miyabe Nono. Nono sniffles as she explains that the hospital contacted her father, who immediately sent her over from her home nearby. Fuuta realizes she lives close because her grandfather owns the hospital. Nono covers her tearful face and reveals that Futa's family has also been contacted and will arrive soon. Fuuta thanks her for coming to see him. Nono grabs Kouko's hands and tearfully thanks her for calling the ambulance and saving Fuuta. Kouko stares back in surprise. Nono breaks down, admitting how terrified she was that something terrible had happened to Fuuta. Her loud sobs leave Kouko speechless. Fuuta watches her cry with a sweat drop, touched by how much she cares but thinking she might be taking it a little too far. His mind suddenly returns to his past life as Phone, remembering how he was struck down on the temple steps and wondered if he was about to die. Fuuta touches his neck as another memory comes back to him. Kouko had told him that he still had to suffer 7 more deaths, making our boy suddenly wonder what had just happened. Fuuta lifts the hospital blanket and gasps when he sees his foot covered in bandages. He panics, fearing that his leg might be broken. Daiki asks if Fuuta broke his leg, while Tetsu and Umi worry about how badly it looks. Back in class with a crutch, Fuuta explains that his leg is not broken after all. He thought it was at first, but it turned out to be only a sprain. Daiki happily offers to carry Fuuta on his shoulders, but Fuuta quickly refuses, admitting that he is scared of heights. Nono smiles and suggests that a kiss might make him feel better. Fuuta immediately blushes and tells her to calm down. Tetsu seriously considers bending Futa's leg the other way, making our boy panic and tell him to leave it alone since it is not even broken. Umi then smiles and offers to test out a new judo throw on him. Fuuta can only stare in disbelief and ask what is wrong with her. Kouko quietly reads her book and comments that Fuuta has some very caring friends. He rests his head on the desk and agrees. Later in class, Kouko slips a folded note onto Futa's desk. She asks him to meet her on the roof after class, leaving him wondering what she has planned. After class, Fuuta makes his way onto the rooftop with his crutches. He nervously wonders why Kouko chose this place and hopes she is not planning to throw him off the roof. Fuuta turns around just as the door slams shut behind him. A voice acknowledges that he made it, leaving him frozen in shock. Kouko stands on the rooftop ledge with her arms crossed, while East waves from beside the ladder. Fuuta stares up in alarm and asks what she is doing up there. Kouko calmly says she likes heights and hopes he enjoys the view because this will be his last memory. Fuuta nervously warns her that he can see up her skirt from below. Kouko remains on the edge and coldly reveals that she planned to kill him anyway. A gust of wind lifts Kouko's skirt, revealing her gym shorts underneath. Fuuta slumps over his crutches, slightly disappointed that she is wearing shorts. Kouko turns toward him and says they should talk about his dream. Fuuta looks up in surprise. Fuuta explains that he saw visions of the past that felt strangely real and familiar. He remembers seeing Rei, Phone, and the hooded priest in those memories. Fuuta hesitantly wonders if he was actually present in those memories. He recalls Kouko asking whether he believed in reincarnation and realizes this was the first memory he had recovered. Kouko confirms it and praises his realization. As Fuuta processes everything, the ghostly figure of Phone appears beside him. He finally realizes that he was Phone in his past life. The ghost of Stona appears beside Kouko as she stands on the ledge with her arms crossed. She reminds Fuuta that he knows her as Stona and says it has been a long time. Fuuta stares ahead with a sweat drop, completely overwhelmed by the bizarre revelation. East looks at Fuuta and asks if he is Fuuta Okeya, then points out that the girl on the ledge is Kouko. Fuuta listens in surprise. Kouko firmly tells East to be quiet, and he immediately falls silent. Kouko admits that she has no idea where or when their past life took place. After a brief pause, Kouko tells Fuuta that she has a message from a girl named Rei. His eyes widen in shock. A memory of Rei appears as she holds up the handmade sandals with a sweet smile. She declares her love for Phone and promises to wear the sandals all the way to heaven, leaving Fuuta speechless. Kouko explains that the ceremony required everyone to wear specific clothing, but Rei refused to give up her sandals. The priests eventually made an exception and allowed her to keep them. Tears stream down Fuuta's face as he realizes those are the same sandals he made for Rei in his past life as Phone. Kouko quietly confirms that they are indeed the same ones. Kouko quietly reflects that it took a long time, but she has finally kept her promise to Rei. Fuuta stares at her in confusion as Kouko closes her eyes, seemingly lost in thought. Kouko reaches out her hand and says it is time for her own duty. A glowing weapon suddenly appears in her grip. Fuuta stares at it in shock, realizing he has seen the weapon before. Kouko reveals the glowing ring covered in ancient symbols and identifies it as the Spirit Circle. Fuuta repeats the name in confusion, wondering what the Spirit Circle actually is. Kouko points the weapon at him and explains that Phone's life was only one of his past lives. He must now suffer through the rest of their shared history. Fuuta breaks into a nervous sweat and desperately asks why he has to go through all of this. Kouko glares at him and coldly declares that she is going to kill him. Fuuta panics and demands to know what he did to deserve this. Kouko turns away and tells him that he will remember the reason as they continue. Her purpose is to destroy his soul and finally end the cycle of death and rebirth. Kouko raises the spirit circle above her head, declaring that the weapon will help her accomplish her goal. She points the spirit circle at Fuuta and declares that, after all these years, this is finally their declaration of war. Kouko glares down from the rooftop and declares that this will be the last time. She intends to end their eternal conflict once and for all. Fuuta grips his crutches and shouts back that he does not understand. Whatever happened between them belongs to the past. He leans forward and pleads with Kouko, insisting that Phone and he are not the same person. But Fuuta hesitates as he realizes that, in some way, Phone really is him. Fuuta insists that he only met Kouko for the first time yesterday and simply wanted to become friends with her. Kouko stares at him without emotion and simply asks why. Fuuta freezes at the blunt question, struggling to come up with an answer. Kouko agrees that the past cannot be changed, but points out how quickly Fuuta forgets. She reminds him that his injured leg came from being attacked yesterday, leaving him stunned. Fuuta struggles to respond, stammering as he desperately tries to explain himself. He drops his crutches with a loud clatter and crosses his arms, angrily insisting that his legs are fine and that he clearly remembers falling by himself. Kouko and East stare at him blankly as Fuuta trembles in agony, sweating heavily while desperately trying to act tough. Fuuta collapses onto the rooftop, screaming in pain while stubbornly insisting that he is fine and that it does not hurt. Kouko simply stares at him. Kouko remembers Tetsu stopping her in the hallway to thank her for taking Fuuta to the doctor. He even bows deeply in gratitude. She also remembers Umi and Daiki thanking her for helping Fuuta. Daiki admits that Fuuta can be a handful, while Umi says they were worried about him. Back on the rooftop, Kouko silently watches as Fuuta rolls around in agony. East smiles and remarks that Fuuta is pretty cool in his own way. Kouko remains on the ledge, clearly unimpressed. Kouko looks away and says she has already told him everything she came to say. Now, she is leaving. Kouko climbs down and heads for the exit with East following behind. Fuuta quickly calls out for her to wait. Fuuta sits on the rooftop floor, clutching his injured leg as he thanks Kouko for delivering Rei's final message. East smiles with his eyes closed, while Kouko simply says she did not do it for him. She then leaves and slams the door shut behind her. As Fuuta lies on the ground, the bloodied ghost of Phone appears beside him. He declares that he will never forgive Kouko and that she must suffer. Fuuta glares at him and snaps that nobody asked for his opinion. The scene then shifts to his home, where the family gathers for dinner. During dinner, Fuuta asks his mother what she would do if someone were reincarnated. He mentions a baby who claimed to be someone else reborn. Fuuta's mother rests a hand on her pregnant belly and smiles, saying he comes up with the strangest things sometimes, just like his father. She then adds that it would be nice to see his grandmother again. Fuuta watches his mother with a sweat drop as she excitedly talks about seeing his grandmother again. Later that night, Fuuta lies in bed with his bandaged foot resting on the mattress, staring at the ceiling as he thinks about everything that happened. He remembers Kouko's warning about 7 more deaths and wonders if something like that could really happen. He considers borrowing some of his father's books to find answers. Fuuta closes his eyes as he remembers Kouko's vow to destroy his soul and end the cycle of death and rebirth. He can only conclude that he must have been a real jerk in his past lives. A tear runs down his face as he remembers Rei's message. The whole thing is hard to believe, but he knows it would be even harder to fake something like this. Fuuta thinks about East and wonders if he came from a different time than Phone. Maybe he followed them from another past life. He then remembers another dream, where 4 figures walked across a grassy field. Fuuta realizes that must have been another one of his past lives. The memory brings back images of East, a young Kouko, and another version of himself. He struggles to remember the name of the pigtail-haired girl who was with them. Then, lying in bed, Fuuta suddenly remembers her name, Rune. A pigtail-haired girl named Rune suddenly bursts into Fuuta's room, leaving him completely stunned. Fuuta panics as Rune tumbles onto his bed, happily calling him her master. Rune leans close with tears of joy, saying she came the moment he called and has missed her master terribly. Fuuta can only stare at her in confusion. Rune grabs Fuuta's hands and excitedly reveals that she brought the item he left with her. She eagerly asks for praise as a bright light shines from their hands. A glowing spirit circle suddenly appears in Fuuta's hand. He stares at it in shock while Rune beams proudly behind him. Fuuta gasps in shock when he realizes the glowing object in his hand is the spirit circle. Rune stares at him with sparkling eyes as a confused Fuuta tries to understand what is going on. Rune suddenly cries out in disbelief, asking how her master could say that. Fuuta jumps back on the bed, clutching the spirit circle. Tears pour down Rune's face as she reminds him that he told her to wait for his call. She waited for so long that she insists she should be the one asking the questions. Fuuta stares at her in disbelief, realizing she appeared simply because he called her name. He begins to wonder if he really is her master. Rune points proudly at herself and happily confirms that she is indeed Rune. A moment later, the front door opens downstairs, and Fuuta's mother welcomes someone home. Fuuta realizes his father has returned. His father enters the room with a cheerful greeting, and proudly shows him a plush toy he won from a claw machine. Rune excitedly waves at Fuuta's father and introduces herself, leaving Fuuta completely stunned. Fuuta's father stares at the two in stunned silence as Fuuta frantically waves his hands and insists everything is fine. His father simply calls it a shame, says goodbye, and steps back out of the room. Fuuta sighs in relief, admitting that his father gave him a scare. Rune then realizes he cannot see her. The door suddenly flies open again as his father calls his name, making Fuuta yelp in panic. His father falls silent and scans the room with a sharp, serious look. He narrows his eyes, sensing that something strange might be lurking in the room. Rune excitedly waves her arms to announce herself, but Fuuta quickly tells his father not to barge in and reminds him that he deserves some privacy. His father peeks through the doorway and explains that he thought the ghost of a fallen warrior might have followed Fuuta home. He tells him to speak up if his ghost sight reveals another visitor. Fuuta covers his ears in embarrassment, wondering if his parents are messing with him. Meanwhile, they joke about celebrating their son finally standing up for himself. Rune leans close and softly calls him her master, leaving Fuuta flustered and struggling to respond. Rune looks directly at Fuuta and asks him to explain what is happening, including where and when they are. Fuuta hesitates before explaining that when she calls him master, she is actually referring to Fortuna. Rune confirms that Fortuna is indeed his name, then wonders why his father called him Fuuta. He falls silent for a moment. Fuuta explains that he is now Fuuta Okeya and that Fortuna was his identity in a past life. Unfortunately, that is all he can remember. He admits that he has no idea what is happening, leaving Rune completely stunned. Rune slumps forward in dismay as Fuuta raises the spirit circle. He explains that Fortuna left it with her and wonders why he would have needed it. Rune sighs sadly and explains that her master created the spirit circle, but that is all she knows about it. Fuuta stares at the glowing weapon in disbelief, struggling to accept that he created it himself. He studies the glowing flame and notices that the symbols on it keep changing. He wonders if they all represent the number 2. The spirit circle feels solid in his hand, despite its strange nature. As its glowing energy fades away, Fuuta realizes how to make it disappear. Fuuta recalls seeing Kouko wield a weapon covered in burning flames and strange symbols, making him suspect there is a deeper meaning behind them. Rune looks at him hesitantly and asks if her master has any other orders for her. Fuuta nervously scratches his head and apologizes, explaining that he called her by accident and has nothing for her to do. He tells her she can go. Rune immediately bursts into tears, devastated by his words. She crawls across the bed toward him and begs him not to send her away because she has nowhere else to go. With tears in her eyes and her hands clasped together, Rune desperately begs to stay by his side. Fuuta blushes awkwardly before finally giving in and telling her she can stay. Rune cries tears of joy and thanks her master, while Fuuta wonders how he could possibly refuse her. He quickly realizes he is stuck with her now. The next day, they arrive at school. Rune stretches her arms excitedly as she looks around the school, asking where they are. She is fascinated by how all the boys and girls are dressed alike. Fuuta sits at his desk with his crutches and tells Rune to calm down, explaining that this is a school. She immediately cheers, declaring that she likes school. Fuuta stares ahead, realizing that Rune really does not understand much. For a ghost, she is surprisingly cheerful. He wonders what he is supposed to do with her, and whether she will eventually be reborn. Suddenly, Rune calls out in surprise. Kouko stands beside East and stares in shock after noticing Rune. Fuuta starts to greet her, but Rune excitedly interrupts and shouts that it has been so long since she last saw East. East smiles warmly and waves, happy to see her again. Rune turns to Kouko with a bright smile and calls her little Kouko, happily saying that she has not seen either of them in ages. Fuuta watches the reunion in confusion, struggling to understand what he is seeing. Tears fill Kouko's eyes as she softly whispers Rune's name. Kouko wipes away her tears as East gently remarks that she missed Rune too. A panicked Rune immediately asks what is wrong and begs her not to cry. Fuuta wonders how Rune knows that name, then realizes Kouko may have been Kouko's name in a past life. The connection between the two names suddenly makes sense. Kouko covers her face as she holds back tears and asks Fuuta how many of his past memories have returned. Fuuta admits that he remembers very little, with only her name coming back to him. Kouko gives him a stern look and warns that Rune can physically interact with people unlike most ghosts. She tells him to keep his hands to himself. Fuuta blushes in shock at the warning, while Rune stands quietly beside him. He quickly denies ever doing anything like that, though he remembers how Rune knocked him over when they first met. Later at the school pool, Kouko tosses aside her kickboard and her swimsuit. Rune excitedly cheers for her as Fuuta watches from nearby. Daiki sits with his eyes closed, wondering if Kouko has looked his way, while Tetsu leans over and asks Fuuta what he is staring at. Fuuta waves his hands defensively from the ground and insists he was not looking at anything. Near the pool fence, Nono, Kouko, and Umi stand together in their swimsuits. Kouko dries her hair with a towel, while Nono and Umi stand beside her. Fuuta and Daiki watch from nearby. Rune floats beside Fuuta as he heads home on crutches, happily asking where they are going next. She is still delighted that East and Kouko are doing well after all this time. Fuuta walks thoughtfully and asks how Rune, East, and Kouko all knew each other in the first place. Rune explains that East was Fortuna's friend and disciple, while Kouko was East's daughter. Fuuta can barely believe he actually had a disciple. Fuuta wonders what kind of person he was in his past life. The two stop when they spot East and Kouko approaching from down the street. Rune excitedly waves them over, calling out to East and Kouko. Kouko smirks and reveals that they never liked Fortuna much, because he always claimed everyone but himself was a moron. East laughs and admits that Fortuna really did say things like that, while Rune giggles beside him. Fuuta sweats nervously at the revelation before turning to Kouko and asking if she wanted something. Kouko suddenly summons her flaming spirit circle and points it at Fuuta, making him lean back in alarm. Fuuta stares at the weapon in panic, wondering if she is about to send him back again. Kouko glances at his bandaged foot before silently staring at him. Fuuta drops his crutches and quickly insists that he only fell by accident and is perfectly fine. Kouko dismisses the matter and says his next memory can wait. She will return once his leg has healed. Rune wonders why Fuuta and Kouko do not get along. He admits that he has no idea. Rune points out that he likes Kouko and reminds him how he once praised her body. Fuuta immediately panics and insists he never mentioned breasts. Kouko angrily chops him on the head and calls him a disgrace, along with his gross friends. Kouko storms off and tells Rune to stay with her if Fuuta tries anything funny. East waves goodbye as she leaves. Fuuta lies flat on the ground and sarcastically agrees with Rune, who nervously admits that she may have said too much. As Fuuta lies there with his crutches beside him, he decides that nobody needs weird magic hoops, past lives, or some grand destiny. That kind of nonsense belongs in video games. Fuuta sits on a park bench with Tetsu and Daiki as they discuss a section at the bookstore down the hill. Daiki mentions it, while Fuuta jokes that he is tall enough to avoid getting carded. Tetsu adds that having their own computers would make things easier. Daiki considers getting an after-school job to save for a laptop. Fuuta mentions seeing some for around 350, then thinks about how much fun he has hanging out with Nono and Umi too. Tetsu considers saving his allowance for a while Fuuta realizes that simply sitting around and talking with the guys is what he enjoys most. Fuuta smiles to himself, thinking that even if their conversations get a little off color, this is exactly how he wants to spend his time. Daiki raises a hand and cheerfully greets Mr. Azuma as he approaches. Mr. Azuma waves back and happily remarks on how well the boys are getting along. He waves goodbye and reminds them not to stay out too late. The boys politely agree. Fuuta asks if Daiki is close with their teacher. Daiki smiles, while Tetsu explains that Mr. Azuma is simply easy to talk to. Fuuta heads home on his crutches with Rune beside him, wishing he could forget about the past life mess and simply focus on letting his leg heal. He wishes they could all just be normal friends, including Kouko. Rune suddenly points ahead and calls for her master to look. Fuuta turns and spots a shadowy figure carrying a spear in the distance. A heavily armored warrior stands on the walkway, riddled with arrows and armed with a spear and sword. He mutters about guarding the road with his life and wonders if he can trust Fortuna with the princess. The bloodied samurai glares ahead and declares that he will never fall to an enemy. Fuuta grips his crutches nervously, deciding that the warrior looks like trouble and they should stay away. Rune cheerfully waves at the armored figure and offers to pull out his arrows, leaving Fuuta horrified. The samurai lets out a fierce, agonized growl at the sudden intrusion. He swings his weapon wildly and roars that nobody will pass, forcing Rune to dodge out of the way. The warrior turns toward Fuuta, and Fuuta realizes in panic that he is coming straight for him. The samurai raises his blade overhead and lets out a fierce battle cry to the emperor. Fuuta throws up an arm and braces for the blow, but when nothing happens, he slowly opens his eyes in confusion. Fuuta thrusts his glowing spirit circle into the samurai, sending dark energy surging through his body. Smoke and sparks scatter as the samurai gasps at the sight of the glowing weapon. Fuuta stares back in shock. Rune catches a glowing spectral dagger and smiles gently, praying that it will finally grant the fallen warrior eternal rest. Fuuta recalls Kouko wielding her flaming spirit circle and threatening to destroy his soul with it. Sitting among his fallen crutches, Fuuta stares at his spirit circle in horror, realizing that it is a weapon designed to kill souls. October arrives, and the school remains quiet. Fuuta stands on the school rooftop, thinking about how quickly time passes and how he has ended up in this situation again. Rune leans against the railing nearby, while Kouko stands beside East. Kouko notices Fuuta and checks if he has fully recovered, relieved to see that he has. She immediately raises her glowing spirit circle and aims it at him, telling him to get ready to continue. Kouko swings at him without hesitation. Fuuta panics and throws up his hand, desperately telling her to wait and stop. The attack stops mid-swing. Kouko stares at him in surprise before asking what he means. Fuuta explains that touching the weapon will reveal another past life. Since a simple touch is enough, he cannot understand why she keeps resorting to violence. Kouko gives him a cold glare and admits she simply prefers doing things this way. She tells him to get on with it, leaving our boy convinced that she has some serious issues. Fuuta reveals his own spirit circle and explains that he found one too. If touching it is all that's needed, he can experience the memory later on his own. More importantly, he has no intention of passing out on the rooftop again. Kouko is stunned when she sees Fuuta holding a spirit circle, unable to believe he has one. Fuuta assumes Fortuna must have left the spirit circle with Rune. The moment he mentions her name, Rune jumps up excitedly and asks if her master called her. Fuuta quickly tells her to forget it. Kouko falls silent, wearing a blank expression as she gathers her thoughts. She explains that using a spirit circle requires intense focus and a strong desire to see a past life. Touching the circle to the head or heart triggers the vision, but reaching the required state of concentration is difficult. Fuuta thinks it sounds simple enough, but Kouko points out that finding that level of focus is the hard part. She insists it would be much faster if she handled it herself. Fuuta immediately runs off, waving goodbye, as he says he will try it himself and tell her about it tomorrow. Kouko calls after him to stop. He pauses and looks back as Rune rushes after him, begging her master not to leave her behind. Kouko asks if he really plans to do it himself, and why. She adds that if he is lying, it will be easy enough to prove. Fuuta scratches his head and admits he is telling the truth. Even so, he does not fully understand what is happening, hates the idea, and would rather not do it. He gives her a gentle smile and suggests that learning more about their past lives might help them clear up their bad blood and finally get along. Kouko stares at Fuuta in stunned silence, clearly shaken by his words. Fuuta heads for the exit and says goodbye. Rune excitedly waves to Kouko and East, promising to see them tomorrow. East smiles and waves back as Kouko turns away. Kouko glares at the ground, bitterness filling her expression as she curses Fortuna. She cannot understand what Fuuta could possibly know and insists things are not that simple. East reminds her that Fuuta is not Fortuna. His name is Fuuta Okeya. With a gentle smile, East adds that Fuuta seems like a genuinely good kid. Kouko quietly acknowledges his words, admitting that she knows. But that is exactly why she refuses to give up. Night falls over the city as Rune's singing fills the apartment. Fuuta lies in bed, clutching his spirit circle, sweating in confusion while Rune happily sings and dances beside him. Rune strikes a lively pose on the bed and finishes her strange song. Fuuta sits up in shock, wondering what on earth she is singing and dancing about. Rune beams proudly and explains that she was trying to cheer her master up with a little song and dance, then asks if he liked it. Fuuta complains that her performance is doing the opposite and wonders how he is supposed to focus like this. He then notices her outfit and asks if she is supposed to be cosplaying. Rune wonders if her performance was not good enough, reminding him that he said he did not even want to see his past lives. Fuuta admits he just wants a little peace and quiet. Rune suggests that maybe her master is subconsciously resisting the process. Fuuta falls silent, considering her words. He sits on the bed clutching the spirit circle, still hesitant to use it. Suddenly, Rune snatches the spirit circle from his hand and declares that she knows what to do. Fuuta can only stare in shock as she takes over. Rune holds up the spirit circle and explains that they want to uncover her master's history with Kouko. Fuuta reluctantly agrees. She raises the spirit circle and wishes him luck before starting a countdown. Futa's eyes widen in panic as he realizes what she is about to do. Rune smacks Fuuta across the head with the glowing spirit circle, sending a loud clash through the room. A ringing sound fills the void as Fuuta floats through the darkness, staring down in complete shock. Rune floats nearby with a bright smile. Fuuta looks up at the brilliant light in awe as fragments drift through the space around him. Rune cheerfully waves goodbye as she tumbles through the void, telling her master she will see him next time. Fuuta falls backward beneath her as glowing fragments scatter through the air. A window of light reveals a strange memory. Fuuta sees a young man examining a ring-shaped object. Van suddenly snaps out of a daze while riding across the countryside, confused as he mutters Fortuna's name. Syrah calls out to him, joking that he nearly fell asleep in the saddle. Van stammers, unsure of what he was saying, while Syrah calls to the knight leading the group. The knight announces that they will continue on foot as they approach the witch's lair. Van agrees, while Syrah shudders at the thought of facing a witch and her terrifying magic. Syrah brushes off the rumors with a gentle smile, claiming they are probably nothing more than exaggerated tavern tales. An elderly man nervously warns Syrah not to speak so lightly of darkness, reminding him that mocking it also mocks the light of their lord. Syrah quickly apologizes. Van turns to Syrah and asks if he can have the honor of subjugating the witch once they arrive. Syrah laughs and praises his bravery, assuring him that his moment of glory will come soon enough. Van responds with an awkward smile. The elderly man is stunned that Van will take on the duty, but Syrah's words reassure him that Van will get his chance. Syrah tries to explain that this will be Van's first duty, but the elderly man sharply orders him to be silent. Van bows deeply and thanks his lord, calling it an absolute honor. Syrah turns serious and asks Van if he has ever taken a life before. Van hesitates before admitting that he has not. As they continue down the path, Syrah tells Van to avoid looking into the witch's eyes and stop thinking of her as human. If their gazes meet, he warns, Van may regret it. Van quietly follows. Van wonders if even an enemy should not be treated with dignity and asks whether they are really willing to abandon their code. He quickly apologizes after realizing he has spoken out of turn. Syrah tells him not to be afraid of speaking honestly, though he warns him to choose his words carefully. Van nods as a knight up ahead announces that they have found the place. Syrah tells Van to stay focused, while the elderly man nervously warns him to beware of the witch's curses. Van takes a deep breath and assures his lords that he is ready. Van approaches an isolated house, introducing himself as a knight of the order as his armor clanks with every step. Van reflects on how he has spent his life training to become a worthy guardian of the land and its people. Now, he has finally been given the chance to fulfill that duty. With one hand on his sword, he declares that he has come to eliminate the raven-haired witch who corrupts hearts and destroys their peace. He draws his sword with a sharp glint, reminding himself that he is not here for glory, but for what he believes is right. Van pushes open the heavy wooden door and declares that he will fulfill the duty he was given. A shadowy figure holding a basket turns toward him in surprise and asks, "Who is there?" Kouko turns around with a basket of herbs in her hands. She stares at him in confusion before quietly recognizing him as a knight. Van freezes as a dark aura surrounds him. The moment he sees her, something inside him screams that she is the enemy and must be killed before it is too late. His eyes fill with murderous intent as dark thoughts consume him. In his mind, she is unforgivable and must suffer. Van storms into the room with his sword drawn, declaring that the witch's life ends today. He vows in the name of Van Flantier to punish her crimes and demands that she repent before being condemned to the flames. Kouko panics and insists she has committed no crimes. Van immediately cuts her off, calling her words lies and heresy. Crashes and clattering echo from inside the house. Outside, Sira watches the building while the elderly man nervously prays for Van's safety. Inside, Van and Kouko breathe heavily as they lock eyes in a tense confrontation. Van pins Kouko down and drives his sword into her chest as she struggles against the blade. The cottage lies in ruins around them as both breathe heavily. Van screams for her to die and burn in damnation. Blood drips from Kouko's mouth as she coughs and calls him a fool, lamenting that the medicine meant for the village had been so close. Kouko gasps for breath and warns Van that he will not escape the consequences. With her remaining strength, she reaches into the fireplace and grabs a red-hot ember. She presses the burning ember against Van's cheek, making him scream as smoke rises from his skin. Kouko glares at him and curses him as an idiot, declaring that her curse will leave its mark on him and his hollow honor forever. Outside, the elderly man notices that the cottage has gone quiet. Sira spots Van emerging from the doorway, covered in blood and barely dragging himself forward. Van steps outside with his blood-stained sword, a fresh burn marking his cheek. A grim verse echoes about a man searching for water, warning that anyone who meets his gaze will be forced to dig forever. Sira rushes to Van and asks if he is injured, noticing the burn on his face. The elderly man points to the head inside the sack and praises Van for completing the task. Sira urges Van to speak, but he absent-mindedly hums a verse about being careful while milling flour. Sira stops him, saying this is no time for songs. Van explains that the tune was one his tutor used to sing. He repeats it to calm himself after what he has done. Sira decides they have stayed long enough, and tells everyone that it is over and they should leave. The elderly man agrees and reaches for the sack, offering to carry it. Van wonders if taking a life always leaves someone this exhausted, amazed that such a simple task could drain him so completely. Sira replies that he believes it always does. Sira tells Van to come along. Van sighs and touches the burn on his cheek as they leave. The grand manor stands peacefully beneath the sky, as Van reflects on how long he dreamed of this moment. At last, he is a true knight. Van walks through the halls of his home as servants bow to him. Inside a room, his father stands by the window and delivers a shocking declaration. Van is banished. The witch's brand remains visible on Van's cheek as his father explains that the Flantier family will not tolerate the disgrace of someone marked by black magic. Their family's future will instead be entrusted to Van's brother. With his honor shattered, Van begins to reflect on how his journey truly started. Van meets Sira in his hooded cloak, the fresh burn scar marking his cheek. Sira has already heard the news. Because of the scar, Van is now considered cursed, unfit to inherit the Flantier house, and has no place left in the order. Sira calls it a terrible pity before handing Van a heavy bag of money from his father. He tells him to spend it carefully so it can last for years. Van accepts the jingling bag and thanks him, quietly realizing that this is the last thing his family will ever give him. Sira reminds Van that he has known his father for many years and considers him like a brother. He assures Van that he cares for him as well and tells him to seek his help whenever he needs it. Van sincerely thanks Sira, admitting that he has always cared for him too. Sira says that in another life, he might have called Van his son. Van points out that the church would not approve of such beliefs, making Sira laugh as he jokes about avoiding another reprimand. The two share a quiet chuckle, giving Van one last warm moment before they part ways. Sira asks where Van plans to go, and after a moment of thought, Van decides that he will head to the sea. Van bows farewell and walks away, leaving Sira behind in the open field as he raises a hand in goodbye. Van travels alone along the sandy shore, a sack slung over his shoulder as waves roll onto the beach. He follows a grassy path to a small house near the seaside cliff. After wandering for 6 months, Van has finally settled down to begin a new life here. Van gazes across the vast sea, remembering how he survives by catching fish and hunting rabbits in the nearby woods. Outside his home, he trains with his sword, keeping his skills sharp. Van spends his days alone at a wooden table, quietly drinking his troubles away. Whenever he visits town for more drink, Van covers his burned scar with bandages. Even then, his appearance still unsettles the people around him. With his head resting in one hand, Van wonders if he should wear the scar with pride. After all, he earned it while defeating a servant of evil. Yet as Van sits alone outside his home, he admits that he cannot bring himself to see the wound that way. His mind returns to Kouko, blood dripping from her mouth as she cursed his honor and wished for her brand to remain with him forever. The memory fills Van with frustration. He grips his sword tightly and steels himself, his resolve finally returning. Van raises his sword and smashes the wooden chair to pieces, blaming Kouko for everything that happened to him. He pants heavily as the rage leaves him exhausted and drenched in sweat. After catching his breath, Van stares at the wreckage before dragging the broken pieces away with his sword. Years later, Van hears that his brother has succeeded him and that his father has passed away. On the street, Van watches a young boy walk hand in hand with his father. The boy promises to work in the family shop when he grows up, but insists that he will be the one in charge. His father laughs and suggests opening another branch for him. Van walks away carrying a wooden keg, quietly wishing his father peace in the afterlife. As Van makes his way through a narrow stone alley, a voice suddenly calls him a leper. He stops in surprise. A man named Steele waits at the end of the alley with his sword drawn. He calls Van by his full name and declares that it is time for him to die, insisting that it is nothing personal. Van stares at the armed man in confusion, unable to understand why he has been targeted. Steele suddenly lunges at him with terrifying speed. Van drops the keg and realizes with horror that an assassin has come for his life. Van draws his sword just in time, barely blocking Steele's thrust as their blades collide. Steele looks surprised that Van managed to stop the attack, while Van grits his teeth under the pressure, realizing he escaped the blow by inches. Sparks fill the narrow alley as the two exchange a rapid barrage of sword strikes without giving an inch. Both fighters finally pull back, gasping for breath as they recover on the stone pavement. Steele is surprised by Van's skill, admitting that he had heard Van's days as a knight were long over. Van praises Steele's swordsmanship, calling him impressive for a backstabbing villain. He then asks how much Steele was paid, suspecting that his brother sent him. Van insists he deserves to know if Sir Flanter ordered his assassination. Steele refuses to reveal his employer, saying that he cannot disclose who hired him. Van makes him an offer instead, promising even more money if Steele abandons the mission and joins him. He assures him that he will never have to worry about money again. Van's offer leaves Steele baffled. When Van asks if the deal does not appeal to him, he raises his sword and declares that they will continue the fight with no mercy. Steele laughs in disbelief and waves off the fight, calling Van a mad bastard. After catching his breath, Steele admits that such an offer is rare for a sellsword. He accepts, promising to become a fine knight in Van's service. Steele introduces himself, and the two shake hands in the alley. Van warns him not to take their oath lightly. Later, Van shares drinks with Steele at a table. With his tongue loosened by alcohol, Steele reveals that Van's brother really did send him to kill him. Van takes a drink, realizing his brother likely sees him as a threat simply because he is the eldest son, despite being disowned and barely connected to the family. Van quietly hums a strange verse about being careful when selling flowers, never offering the bulbs between one's legs. Steele bursts out laughing and teases him for having such bizarre taste in music. Van blushes slightly and looks away, telling Steele to ignore it because the song simply came to mind. Van realizes his brother is trying to keep costs down by sending only 2 or 3 assassins after him at a time. Van and Steele stand back to back in the open field, ready for battle. Time and again, assassins come after them, but the two manage to drive every wave back. Between the attacks, they pass the time drinking, eating rabbit and fish, and training with their swords. Van continues his quiet life by the coast, constantly hunted by killers sent by his brother with the rogue Steele at his side. Steele holds up his empty jug and calls for Van to bring out his purse. Van sighs, remarking that if it were wine, Steele would probably drink the entire sea dry. As they head toward town, Van reminds Steele that he earns a salary and should spend some of it. Steele jokingly complains that Van is too protective of his money. A crowd gathered outside a building catches Steele's attention. Van recognizes it as a public sermon. The preacher passionately declares that the Lord neither sees nor hears, judges no one, and is nothing at all, leaving mankind to judge itself. He raises his fist and warns the crowd not to be deceived by the church's lies. The townspeople erupt in outrage, calling his words dangerous and demanding to know what gives him the right to preach such things. The preacher's face twists with anger as he orders the foolish crowd to be silent and listen if they wish to be saved. Van and Steele stare in disbelief as the preacher declares that the flesh is the temple and the heart is the Lord. The furious crowd calls for him to be dragged down and hanged. As they carry their kegs through the alley, Steele comments on the strange priest and his reckless words against the church. Van figures he may simply be a pilgrim driven mad by hunger. The two spot a young boy farther down the path, but before they can react, the priest comes sprinting past them, shouting for them to move. The priest races down the narrow alley, forcing Van and Steele aside as he charges straight toward the boy. The priest and the boy briefly lock eyes before the priest suddenly turns the corner and disappears down another alley. The boy falls to the ground in the commotion. Van asks if he is hurt, while Steele notices the angry mob rushing after the priest. The mob demands to know where the priest went. The boy points in the opposite direction, claiming the priest knocked him down before fleeing that way. The mob falls for the lie and storms around the corner in pursuit. Once the crowd is gone, the boy calmly gets up, dusts himself off, and runs in the opposite direction. Steele watches him leave and marvels at the clever trick. Van wonders if the boy and the priest were working together. Van and Steele head back along the grassy path toward their cliffside home, enjoying the quiet sea. Two shadowy figures are waiting outside when they arrive. Van wonders if they have visitors, while Steele suspects their enemies have grown bolder. The preacher greets them cheerfully and asks if this is their home, requesting a place to hide for a while. Van immediately tells the giant preacher to leave. Steele agrees, pointing out that they have nowhere to hide someone his size. The preacher pulls out a pouch of money, instantly changing Van's attitude. He claims that a former knight cannot turn away someone in need, while Steele agrees that refusing a man of the cloth would be improper. The preacher places a hand over his heart and introduces himself as Glass, an unordained, wandering preacher. The boy beside him introduces himself as Cielo, his disciple. Van eyes Glass suspiciously and questions how an unordained preacher, unrecognized by the church, could possess one of its holy texts. Glass proudly hugs the book to his chest and admits that he may not have all the answers, but he stole it fair and square. Glass reveals that the church itself is after him, not the angry townspeople. Steele laughs and praises his courage and stupidity, while Van immediately tells him to leave. Glass assures Van that they will not stay long. Van still protests, saying they have nothing fit for a priest to eat, only fish and whatever they can hunt. Glass throws his head back and laughs, delighted that fish and beasts are exactly what he loves most. Steele laughs hysterically, joking that they have invited a jester to stay. Van angrily calls Glass a fraud and a villain. Glass promised he would not stay long, but days become weeks, then months. Before long, the three have settled into life together at the cottage. Years pass as Van, Steele, and Glass spend their days drinking together outside the cottage. Glass dismisses curses and witches as nonsense, pointing out that they have not seen a single church enforcer. He tells Van to look around and consider what real misfortune they actually face. Van takes a drink and dryly points out that he is surrounded by two killers, has been driven from his home, and is still being hunted by assassins. He wonders what else his life needs to become darker. Steele argues that their troubles come from ordinary men, not curses, and says Van's superstition is clouding his judgment. He also notes that it has been a while since Van's brother last sent an assassin. Glass insists that magic and miracles are nothing but madness, and that evil comes from the hearts of men. Van points out that Glass's own lack of faith undermines his argument, while Steele jokes that Glass clearly has faith when it comes to cursing the Lord after spilling their last serving of wine. Glass asks what more proof they need, prompting Steele to laugh and accuse him of believing in curses after all. Cielo suddenly steps outside, banging a pan with a spoon as he announces that the soup is ready. He orders them to put down their wine and come inside, while Van notes that Cielo is the only one who never drinks. Smoke rises from the chimney as Van reflects on the years they spent together, filled with constant noise and trouble. He remembers Steele as a shameless rogue who cared about nothing but money and had no pride in his name. When the assassins stopped coming, so did Steele's pay, yet he remained and continued taking advantage of Van's hospitality. To Van, Steele was nothing more than a hopeless, shameless rogue. One day, Steele's drunken life finally caught up with him. He was found dead on the stone pavement after a brawl. After Steele's death, Van's home became a little quieter. Then there was Glass, a blasphemous glutton who shared his foolish ideas as freely as he shared Van's drinks. Glass would grab his stolen holy book and preach for hours, endlessly recounting the church's crimes while Steele listened with complete indifference. One drunken night, Glass stumbled into the well, leaving only his legs sticking out. After that, the house grew quieter still. As for Cielo, Vaughn remembers him as nothing more than an irritating little nag. Cielo sits against the stone wall, reading a book, never touching a drop of alcohol, and spending his free time studying the holy texts. He takes care of the household chores while constantly scolding Van for every mistake with his sharp tongue. After Glass's sudden death, Cielo gathers his master's remains and sincerely thanks Van for taking care of them before returning to wherever they came from. Van watches him leave, calling Cielo a fool. Deep down, he feels that he should have been the one thanking them. As snow falls, Van warms his hands with his breath and hums to himself. With everyone finally gone, his home belongs to him again. He steps inside, still humming about a maiden becoming prey after losing her way, before shutting the heavy wooden door. The next day, Van steps outside with an axe over his shoulder. The cold has set in, so he decides to gather some firewood. A baby's cry suddenly catches his attention. Van looks down and finds an infant lying in a woven basket on the wooden bench. A crying baby lies inside a woven basket on a bench, leaving Van completely stunned. Van leans closer with an axe over his shoulder, wondering where the baby came from and quickly realizing the infant cannot even speak. He picks up the basket and heads outside, carrying the crying baby into the cold. As snow falls around him, Van wonders who could have abandoned the child and why they did not take it to a church. He decides to bring the baby to a sanctuary himself. The baby keeps crying as Van reaches a stone church buried beneath the falling snow. The priest tells Van that he is responsible for taking care of his own guest. Confused, Van waves his hand and tries to explain that the priest has misunderstood him. The priest calmly says that if Van does not want the baby's company, he can simply send the child away. Van cannot believe what he is hearing and points out that he cannot reason with a baby. The priest simply tells him that he will have to teach the child how to speak first. Van finally understands the priest's meaning and realizes he is expected to raise the baby himself. The priest confirms that he has finally figured it out. The priest offers Van some bread and sends him away, slamming the heavy church doors shut as Van is left in the snow, wondering where the divine help is. Van looks down at the basket and sighs. He feels sorry for the unlucky child but decides to take her home, warning that she will have to repay his kindness by doing chores when she grows up. The baby suddenly smiles and raises a tiny hand, letting out a cheerful sound. Van stares at her in shock, before hesitantly calling her Ray. Ray giggles and reaches up with both hands, filling the basket with cheerful sounds. Van carries Ray through the snow and wonders where the name came from. At least the baby has finally stopped fussing. He asks if she likes the name and decides that Ray suits her perfectly. Tears run down Van's face as he realizes he cannot stop crying. Van heads toward his cliffside home and asks Ray if his bandaged face really looks that funny, as she laughs from the basket. He begs a farm woman for some goat's milk for Ray. Despite his bandaged face and the smell of alcohol, she eventually gives in to his desperate pleas. Van works in the fields while the farm woman teaches him how to care for and raise baby Ray. Van carries Ray on his back and leans on a wooden staff, grateful for all the kindness the farm woman would show them over the years. Late at night, Van struggles to calm a crying Ray and begs God to make her stop. He even wishes he could return her to the church, but somehow survives those difficult nights until she finally sleeps through the night. 3 years pass, with Van carrying Ray on his shoulders. 2 more years go by, and the pair now walk hand in hand through the village. Van and Ray share a meal at the table as he remembers a question she once asked him. Ray eats with a wooden spoon and innocently calls Van Papa before asking where her mother is. Without thinking, Van tells her that her mother died from an illness. When Ray asks where he buried her, Van claims that the grave is far away, realizing that one lie has already forced him to create another. As they walk together, Van continues the story, claiming that Ray's mother was beautiful but came from a poor family. He says his own family opposed their relationship, so the two of them eloped. Ray claps excitedly with sparkling eyes, amazed that her parents ran away together and finding the whole story incredibly romantic. Ray shakes Van awake and begs him to continue the story. She wants to know what happened after he, Steel, and Glass stormed the abandoned castle, and whether he ever saw her mother again after the giant carried her away. Van pulls fishing nets along the shore while telling Ray about the time he faced a giant serpent. He claims that he sliced open its belly with twin blades and rescued everyone trapped inside, leaving Ray thrilled by the story. Van carries a barrel of fish with Ray and the farm woman, realizing that he has long forgotten the comfort of alcohol. Nothing compares to the happiness he gets from seeing Ray smile. Van remembers how he once trained and fought endlessly, determined to protect others and become a strong, worthy knight. He also remembers the painful years after losing his position, when he spent his days hating and cursing the witch who took it all away. Years pass as Ray grows into a cheerful young girl. Van realizes that he has completely let go of his old ambitions because Ray has become his entire world. Ray proudly shows off her new dress and thanks Van for the gift. He explains that he traded his old sword to a traveling salesman to afford it. Ray is shocked that Van gave away his sword, but he tells her not to worry because he no longer needs it. Deep down, He knows he has grown old while raising her, and the two of them cannot remain in their little home forever. Van and Ray pack their belongings and say goodbye to the farm woman before leaving home together. The farm woman stares at them in disbelief when she learns that Van is leaving to find Ray a husband. Van bows deeply and thanks the farm woman for helping him raise Ray, admitting he cannot imagine how he would have managed alone. She brushes off his gratitude, saying her fields would have been barren without his hard work. The farm woman turns to Ray and asks if she has really thought about this decision. Van may have his reasons, but Ray has no obligation to simply follow his wishes. Ray smiles and admits that she is not ready to get married, but she has always wanted to see the world. Ray waves goodbye as she and Van set off. Van feels genuinely grateful as the farm woman wishes them both good health. The two travel down the open road, marveling at how far it stretches. Van is surprised to learn that Ray has always loved traveling, while she happily admits that she simply enjoys walking. Ray smiles softly as she mentions a dream she once had. Curious, Van asks her to tell him about it. Ray recalls a dream where a boy made her a beautiful pair of sandals that let her walk through the air. She remembers floating above the clouds and feeling incredibly happy. Above the clouds, Ray met God, who pointed toward another lonely boy sitting on a bench. God told Ray to comfort the lonely boy and stay by his side. But just as she reached out to him, she woke up. Ray smiles brightly and says she wants to keep traveling farther and farther. She believes she will eventually find that lonely boy, and together they can be happy. Van is moved to tears once again, overwhelmed by emotions he cannot quite understand. Ray asks what is wrong, but Van wipes away his tears and says it is nothing. He reflects on how a child raised on his lies has grown into such a wonderful girl, realizing these must be the tears of a proud father. Van and Ray travel by horse-drawn cart and pass through distant villages. The journey strains Van's aging body, but he knows he must find someone he can trust with Ray before he loses his strength. Fortunately, he already has someone in mind. They reach the ruins of Van's old home, which he decides to visit one last time, but the place looks nothing like he remembers. Van stops a young man carrying a tool and asks what happened to the house that once stood there. The question catches the young man off guard. The young man explains that the former master was struck in the head by a horse, went mad, and eventually burned the Flantier house down himself. Van is stunned and asks when it happened. The young man says it was long before he was born, adding that his tutor heard the story from his grandfather. Van realizes that nearly 20 years or more have passed, and wonders if the incident happened around the time the killers stopped coming. When the young man asks if he knew them well, Van nervously claims they only knew each other in passing. The young man bids them farewell and walks away singing a song about ignoring priests and kings, while the fields grow wild with weeds. Rai realizes that this really was Van's old household, and finally understands that he was once a noble. Van simply tells her to keep moving. Van nervously insists that the stories are true but claims he has no connection to the place. Ray gives him a knowing smile and decides to take his word for it. Ray finds it strange that the young man knew that song and asks if Van used to like it too. Van quickly denies knowing what she means, privately thinking about how honest she is. That night, Ray asks where they are headed next as they sit around the campfire. Van thinks about his foolish brother, whose own wickedness eventually destroyed everything he had, and cannot help but smile. Van chuckles and tells Ray that he earned the life he has now. He then reveals that they are heading to an old friend's home. Van points toward the distant hills and tells Ray that an honest and kind man named Cielo should live there. He adds that Cielo will be much older now, prompting Ray to excitedly ask if he is handsome. Van remembers Cielo as a young man and assures Ray that he was a good person. Her question leaves him hesitating as they continue toward the hills. The mountains loom in the distance as Van recalls an old saying that a person is closest to losing their footing when they feel most relieved. They finally reach the hill village, where Ray sits down with a tired sigh while Van stretches his aching back. Van suddenly slips and smashes his head against a large stone. Ray gasps as intense pain makes him feel as though flames are bursting from his eyes. Ray cries out for her father as Van lies motionless on the ground. Blood seeps from his head, and he feels a strange warmth as the flames in his vision disappear. Ray frantically waves at two distant figures, begging them to get help because her father is badly injured. Van lies helplessly on the ground and wonders if his life is ending just like his brother's, finding the thought cruelly ironic. Ray cries beside him as Van silently apologizes, realizing that he does not have much time left. Ray begs him to speak and stop singing, but Van can only mumble the old song about milling flour. He wonders if he is really singing and wishes only to see Ray smile again and wipe away her tears. Through his fading vision, Van looks back on his bitter past, remembering how he fought off hunters and killed men without hesitation just to survive. Van looks toward the fading light above him as Ray continues to cry. He wonders if a man who wasted his life in drink and bitterness ever deserved such happiness, but he has no regrets. His only sorrow is leaving Ray behind before he can see her get married. Van gazes at Ray through his fading vision and tells her how much he loves her and how grateful he is that she walked beside him. He asks her to forgive him as he prepares to leave her behind. Ray screams for her father beside his motionless body as three people rush across the field. They call out that Master Cielo is on his way. Fuuta suddenly wakes in bed, clutching his blanket as tears stream down his face. He stares ahead in shock, shaken by the dream. Our boy sits quietly with tears still on his face as Rune stretches her arms and cheerfully greets her master, asking if he had any nice dreams. He admits that he cannot remember the dream, only that it seemed to last a very long time. Rune giggles and says dreams can be strange like that. Our boy touches his cheek, wondering if Rune's dress and the song she sang yesterday were the same ones from his vision. Before he can think further, Rune happily announces that breakfast looks like fish. Daiki waves and greets Fuuta with a cheerful "good morning," while Tetsu joins in beside him. He turns around in surprise, then smiles warmly, and returns their greeting. Daiki asks why Fuuta took so long, while Tetsu notices his red eyes and wonders if he stayed up all night. Fuuta scratches his head and says he only just woke up and is still half asleep. Kouko fixes our boy with a cold glare and demands that he tell her exactly how he died. She gives the wide-eyed, sweating Fuuta a faint smirk and asks him to recount the brave knight's victory over the innocent medicine woman.